Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rewatch Project with Hannah and Mike. I am Mike, and with me, as always, is Hannah. How are you this evening, Hannah?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. It is a glorious summer evening here in Wellington, New Zealand. We had to start the beginning of this podcast several times.
This is take three.
Yeah, not only because we flubbed, but because the world's noisiest seagulls were gulling around outside. But now we are here, we are back. If you're a new viewer or listener, we cover our favourite film and television franchises in aggressive detail.
Aggressive detail, I like that.
Yeah. Exhaustive, fatiguing detail, you could say. We are now onto an entirely new franchise. Which franchise is that, Hannah?
Babylon 5, with the first episode, pilot episode, being called The Gathering.
All right.
This is a feature-length episode, so strap yourself in for an hour and a half of excellent.
Yeah, late night for us.
Viewing. Yep, this will be a late night for us. So, synopsis says, the opening of a crucial space station is put in jeopardy when the commanding officer is accused of the attempted murder of a diplomat. Murder. Nice murder. It is directed by Richard Compton and written by J. Michael Straczynski, who is also the creator of Babylon 5.
Showrunner. So yes, we are, and for the really incredibly fastidious people amongst us, we are watching the TNT version of the pilot, and we'll get on to what that means.
I was going to say, what does that mean?
Well, don't worry, I will Mike explain that to you and the audience once we get back. So a couple of quick bits of housekeeping before we do that, though. First of all, we always appreciate feedback. We do actually have some pending feedback, but I suggested to Hannah that it might be worth us holding on to that for a short while, purely so we don't alienate any new listeners who are here for the Babylon 5 and are wondering why we're giving feedback for, or receiving feedback for, X-Files and Twin Peaks. That could be a little bit weird. So yeah, if you want to do that, you can send email to rewatchprojectpodcast@gmail.com. We are also on social media, namely Blue Sky and also Instagram, where in both cases we are at Rewatch Proj. That's Rewatch Proj. And also, please do check out our friend shows. I've always been forgetting to do. I haven't done this bit for a while, actually, so I need to remember to do it. So that's the Chinstroker versus Spencer podcast, his film Her Movie, Film Bastards, The Good, the Bad and the Odd, Talk Without Rhythm, and Entertainment Landfill. And we also very much appreciate positive feedback on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And you can also leave comments here on the YouTube channel if you want to, and we will read that out if it feels appropriate to do so. What we'll do is we're going to hit pause. We are going to watch the episode on our TV over yonder right now. It is a 90-minute one, so we will be back in 90 of our minutes, but only, probably less than 60 of yours.
Seconds.
And we will tell you what we thought of said episode and have a little bit of a discussion about it, and also maybe do a little bit of background on our experience with the show. And actually, I should probably broach the subject of spoilers at this point.
Yeah.
Because, as the name suggests, the Rewatch Project is us rewatching our favourite franchises. Babylon 5 is definitely a show that arguably benefits from a rewatch because of, mysteries and reveals and all of this kind of stuff. So watching it a second time is a very different experience. But of course, I'm just mindful of not spoiling it for people who've seen it the first time. So what I'm going to suggest that we do, and this will be a blast from the past for those of you who listen to particularly our early Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episodes.
Very early Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
When we still gave a shit and actually bothered with such things, is that we would do a relatively, I would say, spoiler-free discussion. So Mark from The Good, the Bad and the Odd, if you're watching this, you'll be fine. We might say the odd thing, but I don't think it'll be anything big.
Nothing significant. Yeah. Basically, our spoiler-free section, we talk about the things that have been revealed in that episode or any previous episodes. We don't talk about future events.
That is correct. What we will do is we will then signal to you, the audience, when we're going to move into the spoiler section. And then we will, assuming we have anything additional to say, talk about our feelings of elements of the episode and how they tie into what we know about the show in its future. We're going to hit pause. We are going to watch The Gathering, the pilot episode of Babylon 5, which I should point out isn't on all of the Blu-ray sets. There's a whole rights thing. You might need to go elsewhere to source the pilot. And if you do, as I say, we're not watching the original transmission version. We're watching the TNT version, and we'll get into what that means as soon as we watched it. So yeah, we'll be back very soon to tell you what we thought of this episode.
Just before we sign off, can I also say, if you haven't watched Babylon 5 before, please do adhere to not listening to the spoilers.
Yeah, big time.
Because, and I am someone who always reads the last page of a book. I love a spoiler, but I think if I had sought any of those out before my first watch of Babylon 5, I would have been really, overwhelmed with information and disappointed that I'd done that, because the reveal when it comes is so impactful. Yeah, it would just be a real shame if you denied yourself that by checking it out beforehand.
Every time you cheat with spoilers on Babylon 5, a Vorlon dies. So, and if you want to know what that means, watch this episode of Babylon 5 and discover with us. So, we're going to watch The Gathering. We'll be back with you in no time at all to give you our immediate reactions to this rewatch. So, back real soon.
Bye.
And we're back. So we've just finished watching The Gathering, the feature-length pilot episode of Babylon 5. Now, normally when we finish watching an episode, we go straight into me asking Hannah what her initial impressions of the episode were. But I think because this is our inaugural episode of our coverage of Babylon 5, it might be useful to give a little bit of context as to what our, I guess, individual and collective backgrounds are with this show. So, Hannah, what's your history with Babylon 5?
So, my history of Babylon 5 started from having a big sci-fi rewatch that began with Star Trek Next Gen, moved on through the Star Trek franchise.
It was about 5 or 6 years ago, wasn't
it? So, of course, I encountered Deep Space Nine. And when that resonated a lot with me and I really enjoyed it, you said to me, if you like this, you will definitely like
I think you're
Babylon
ready.
5. You're ready. Yeah. So I was quite keen to give that a go. So once we kind of got through Star Trek, that was our next big rewatch.
Yeah. The great 90s sci-fi rewatch, we called this.
Well, rewatch for Mike, but first time watch for myself. And Mike gave me a lot of caveats before I watched it about, the graphics are pretty clunky to start with. You've got to give a lot of stuff a pass in season 1 as they find their feet.
Yeah. It was a low-budget show.
In terms of styling, not in terms of story. And I was expecting to kind of be into it, but not sort of take a little bit of time to get fully invested. And that wasn't the case at all for me. After watching The Gathering, I was just all in. I didn't care about the fact that, some of the effect shots look like previs from Weta Workshop.
Yeah.
It really just doesn't matter. The acting is fantastic. I love the character.
Some of the acting is fantastic. And we've got to be careful because we're not getting onto our opinions yet. We're talking about our history with the show. But it is a low-budget show. And particularly that first season, particularly the pilot, even more so than the first season. And one of the areas where the show shows its lack of budget is in some of the casting. So some of the extras and some of the smaller roles are played by semi-professional actors, and it shows. But what I'm getting at is when Hannah says that I issued loads of caveats, they were the kinds of things that I was thinking about.
But I kind of disagree with that. Yes, okay, there's some, as of raining, I hadn't noticed kind of acting. It honestly doesn't affect the overall effect of the show.
Oh, no, I agree with that. I agree with that, but that's not what I'm saying.
But I think for me, I'm the type of person that I'm either in or I'm not in.
Yeah.
And usually by the second or third episode of whatever it is we're watching, I know if this is something that has got legs for me or if I just need to cut and run.
Yeah.
And this for me was just from the first minute was just very much like I can get on board. I enjoyed the premise of the pilot episode, the whodunit of it, but I also could see that there was so much character setup going on that it was going to be far greater than that. And that was really appealing to me because not in a, there's going to be other mysteries kind of way, just in a, okay, this is going to be quite a dense world to be a part of, and there's going to be a lot to look at and delve into, and that was really the case. And I can quite honestly say it's in my top 2 of TV shows ever.
I think it helps as well, and one of the reasons why. Well, I'll give my history, and then we'll kind of dovetail and we'll get into talking about this episode. But I mean, I've always been a big sci-fi fan. I've been a Star Trek fan since I was a child. You know, I saw Star Wars at the cinema when I was 4. That was a formative experience. So, you know, and of course, I was like everybody who was a geek. Then I was really into all the 90s Star Trek shows. You know, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, even Voyager, Enterprise. You know, those shows. And Babylon 5,
early edition,
my beloved early edition, and Babylon 5 dropped in the middle of all of that. And I very much, like a lot of people, just thought, oh, this is like a cheap Star Trek knockoff. And it came out around the time of a lot of those shows, you know, like Sliders, Sequest. And, you know, it felt that a lot of them kind of, they sensed they wanted a bit of the Star Trek money, a bit of the Star Trek Latinum, you know. And I just figured this was another one. And I remember my girlfriend at the time watched it. And I remember we were on holiday and it was one random standalone from season 1. And we watched it, and I was just like, "Oh, this is dumb," you know. And it was funny. We were talking to Mark from The Good, the Bad, and the Odd, who we recorded with recently. We did a wrap up roundtable of a few things,
a rousing wrap up.
And what he said, his thoughts of Babylon 5, which he hasn't seen, he's watching along here, were exactly the same as mine. And I think the thing with a lot of sci-fi, particularly television sci-fi, is if you watch it out of context, it does seem really dumb. You know, in the same way that Shakespeare or anything theatrical seems dumb. You know, like the example I always use is if you never watch Star Trek and you watch Worf, you just think that's ridiculous. But when you're watching the show and you're entrenched in the vibe and the mythology and the aesthetics of the show, it doesn't seem dumb. In the same way that a guy talking to a skull in Hamlet seems weird, but when you're in the middle of watching a play, it doesn't, because that's the world, you know? Yeah. But eventually, like a lot of shows, and this has happened to me a few times where I kind of was like, nah, I don't like the look of this. But then part way through it, I start to hear this chorus of voices, both with my friends, and this was pre-internet, at least pre-internet for me, in magazines like SFX and Dreamwatch and the sort of geek magazines at the time, which were our internet in the 1990s. And also my friends watching them. You start to hear a few people going, you know, you should check this show out. And then once you hear that enough, you're like, okay, there's something going on here. And the other times I remember that happening really specifically were Star Trek: The Next Generation. I remember it started and everyone was like, yeah, nah. And then there was this slow whisper of, you know, it's actually getting pretty good. Farscape was another one. Farscape was like, this is Muppets in space. And then after a while, people were like, you know what, actually, there's something there. And Buffy the Vampire. I mean, the fact that it was called a TV show called Buffy the Vampire Slayer about a cheerleader who kills vampires. You know, I was like a 20-year-old dude, so I was just like, I'm not going to watch that. That's ridiculous, you know. And then you hear the voices.
At least I'm not going to tell anyone I'm watching that.
Yeah, that's it. And Babylon 5 was another one of those. And so I watched it and I got really obsessed with it. And all of my friends did. I was living in a house with a couple of my friends, and we were the first people in our social circle to move out of our parents' house. So it was a party house. A party house for geeks. So our idea of partying was, it was for dinosaur dudes, you know what I mean? Our idea of partying was like pizza and early edition. It was pretty hardcore. And we all really got into Babylon 5. And this was at the height of Star Trek mania. This was when Deep Space Nine was on. Generations had come out. It was that sort of, because Babylon 5, I don't think we've said so far, it started in late 1993. And that was really at the peak of Star Trek. You know, Deep Space Nine had just started. There were multiple shows on the air. They were making the movies. The Star Trek exhibition was touring. and Babylon 5 came out, but we were really into it because, and I think primarily it was the story arc. This was before TV shows had story arcs, and that really captured our imaginations. And I remember the peak of this was around late season 3, early season 4, because two things happened. One was we managed to get a contact in America who would send us episodes on VHS.
Yeah.
And this was back when in America they got TV substantially earlier than we did over here in the UK.
You had to wait months and months and months.
Well, with Star Trek The Next Generation, this is going to seem insane now. Do you know there was a 2-year delay between it being on in America? When we've got an episode in the UK, it was 2 years old. I mean, that seems inconceivable now.
Look, up until probably about maybe 10 years ago, maybe slightly less than that, New Zealand was something like 5 or 6 years behind in Coronation Street.
Yeah.
And they had to have this like huge bumper catch-up extravaganza because it was so far out of date that they couldn't, there was never going to be any
Did
chances.
they air like one 17-hour episode of Coronation Street?
Well, I think basically they did this big like sort of, okay, let me catch you up.
A whiteboard.
Yeah, that meme, like,
the Sunny in Philadelphia meme.
Yeah. It was a bit like that. Like, they kind of just had to say, right, this is who's dead. This is who's with who now. This is where everybody else is.
Okay, guys, shit got real.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to just tell you all about this.
Yeah.
You know what they should have done? They should have got the guy from the Ant-Man movies.
Yeah. But
and then she was like, oh my God.
Oh my God. Yeah, it was just, it was far too out of date. So they had to,
And what happened at this? So we were getting the tapes from America. And again, pre-internet, pre-torrent sites, this seemed crazy. What we got season 4 early. And around the time as well was I think the one and only big Babylon 5 convention in Blackpool. And I remember me and my friends, Dan and Jane, we got in the car, we drove to Blackpool. And I remember we got there, we spent some time in the bar. I'm just going to say that. And then Dan had this idea that if he got a clipboard off somebody, we could just jump the queues. Because the way that the convention worked was there was a main stage and people got up and there was awesome stuff happening up there. I'll get into this convention more in later episodes. But they had these little rooms where people were doing signings and there were these massive queues and you'd have like cast members and writers and directors and all these people in there and people would queue for hours. And Dan was like, we can get a clipboard, because he got this thing, I think he heard it in a movie or something, that if you get a clipboard and a confident gait, it can get you in anywhere. So we literally just walked with a clipboard, sort of looking around like this, and people just assumed we were there, and just walked in, and we met everyone, and we were juiced as well. This is when Dan got accidentally locked in a room with Walter Koenig from Star Trek.
That doesn't surprise me.
And all manner of mad stuff happened. But it was amazing because it was at the height of the popularity of the show. And it really did feel like it was just, we were really into the show, is what I'm saying. But with Babylon 5, it can be a bit of a tough sell for people. And I think the reason for that, I'll get into now by starting to ask you, Hannah, on this rewatch, because this is getting into opinions now, what are your initial thoughts on The Gathering now we have just watched it tonight?
Oh my gosh. It's so much more than a pilot of a TV show.
What do you mean?
Well, it really...
Because this is, we should also point out as well, this is Hannah's second watch of Babylon 5.
Yeah.
You talk about how much you enjoyed the show, but we haven't actually gone back and done a rewatch.
No, we haven't. Mainly just from a time point of
view.
View,
There's too many TV shows.
I think it was not long after we finished Babylon 5 that we started the Rewatch Project.
Yeah, and the reason we're covering Babylon 5 now on the Rewatch Project isn't because we thought, oh, that will be a great demographic choice. It was literally just, it's time to rewatch Babylon 5 and we do these podcasts.
And when we watched it the first time, we got about halfway through, and Mike said to me, "I really wish that I'd recorded you
after
each episode, just to get like a reaction."
And that was kind of the chrysalis for the idea of doing a podcast in some ways, wasn't
it? And my need to rewatch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. from the beginning.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So that's where it all came from. The rewatch of the pilot this time, like obviously I'm not going to spoil anything, but when it started, I was just flooded with all the things that are to come. And for it was very much a rewatch feeling this time, in that I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's all of that. Oh my gosh, there's also all of that. Oh my gosh, them.
And was that because just your memory being provoked just by the fact you're watching the show, or was it because of like foreshadowing? Or
I think a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. There was a lot of seeing different characters and thinking of their trajectory and storylines and things. There was definitely some foreshadowing of various things, and it makes you really value the writing of it, because J. Michael Straczynski had a plan.
Yeah.
Like, this is not fly by the seat of your pants.
It's not lost.
No, it's not. It's he knew exactly what he was doing, and that's it. It's so comforting to feel like you're in really safe hands when you're watching something.
Yeah. I mean, obviously when you're rewatching something, you know that.
You know it anyway.
No. What I mean is, you know that you're in safe hands as a fact.
Yeah.
It's not just, this feels like I'm in safe hands. You know you are, so you can just relax into the storyline.
Absolutely. I think, as a pilot, being feature length, it obviously has very much a film feeling.
Yeah, and pilots back then, for hour-long drama shows, they were nearly always feature length. That was the convention back then. Not so much now.
But I sort of feel like this had more of a film structure than some pilots do.
It does have a beginning, middle, and end, doesn't it?
Yeah, and sort of side quest stories with, romantic interludes and comedy beats.
Frictionless sheets.
Yeah, I want to see if I can get some of those.
I've got some thoughts on frictionless sheets, which I will get to.
I feel like I'd slide out of bed.
That's the thing, you see.
And injure myself.
I think,
again,
when it comes to sexiness, you need purchase. I think that, yeah, that's all I'm saying is the fact that, like, how does that even work? Like, you need a little bit of resistance.
Maybe we're doing it wrong.
Yeah. I want to say you need a little bit of resistance. I don't mean that,
Funny. I'm so biased with the show that it's really...
it's not a bias. I mean, if it's based on your opinion.
It is just going to be an absolute love fest from me. I just adore the show from start to finish, and all of the strands of the show. There's not one storyline that I think, ugh.
We're back on that.
Yeah, even the slightly less intense storylines are still interesting.
Yeah, well, you need them.
Yeah. So I very much enjoyed it start to finish, and just felt really grateful and happy to be back in that world.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I mean, I guess it's really interesting watching this, and I'll get into the sort of the different versions as well. This is the TNT version, and what it is that this was.
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Yeah, the TNT are a cable channel in America, and Babylon 5. The original plan for Babylon 5 was always that it would run for 5 seasons. That's one of the reasons why I called it Babylon 5. It was part of the sort of the concept of it, and as Hannah mentioned, Joe Michael Straczynski, JMS, as we will probably call him from here on out, he had this idea for years that he wrote for this TV series. He pitched it everywhere. He pitched it to Paramount, which led to a lot of the rumours that Deep Space Nine plagiarised it. And that's just one of those. Did they? Didn't they? And eventually he got to make it. But the idea was that he always had this plan. He had this plan for this 5-season kind of Lord of the Rings in space storyline, this epic. But of course, this was made in the 1990s when long-form serialized television just did not exist. So he had to play the game. So he knew that he had to kind of, sprinkle in standalones and try and hope that he could slowly introduce the story arc more definitively as it went on. And he managed to do this. He made it through Warner Brothers, but it was done for their cable network. So basically, it didn't have the same budget that a network TV show had. It was very low budget. And they were so low budget that apparently the main Warner Brothers network would send their executives on tours to go and visit the Babylon 5 studios, see how the hell they were doing it, like how they were actually managing to make it. And they had this facility near an airport in LA, and they just built everything there. And it wasn't even a film studio. They just built it and made it there and just did the show like an independent film, basically, but for 5 years. At the end of the 4th season, or near the end of the 4th season, it got cancelled. So they had to accelerate the storyline that Straczynski was telling to fit it in. But then at the very last minute, TNT, a different cable network, bought it for a final season. And what they also asked for was some TV movies as well, which includes In the Beginning, which is a prequel. But one of the things that they also wanted to do was to re-edit and rescore the pilot, because the pilot of Babylon 5, The Gathering, the original version, which isn't the version we watched, you can't even get it anymore. It was released on VHS and it was broadcast on TV. But every time this show has been subsequently re-released on DVD or on Blu-ray or on TV, it's always been this new version. And even this new version is hard to find because there's different versions of it. But one of the reasons that they did it was that the pilot was made as a TV movie. It wasn't actually made as a pilot.
Right.
It was what in the business they call a backdoor pilot, which is where you make a TV movie with the hope that it can be a pilot episode, but if it doesn't go to series, the network can release it as a TV movie just to recoup some of the production costs with advertising
and it has a beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah. And the Twin Peaks pilot did the same thing. And it was made a year before. Now, the reason I mention that is twofold. One is when we get to the next episode, the first episode of season 1, the show looks very different. There's a lot of different cast. I won't go into specifics about that until the spoiler section. But also aesthetically, the show looks a lot different. A lot of the costuming and sets and props look different because it was made a year later and it was a completely different production crew. Same main creatives, of course. And in the original version of the pilot, the music was done by Stuart Copeland, the drummer from The Police.
Really?
And it had a really different vibe. And then when the TV show started, they got a composer who would then go on and do the whole show. And it had a much more traditional kind of orchestral sci-fi score. And other little weird differences, like the fonts were different and the pace of it was different. So TNT were like, well, this pilot now looks a bit weird with the rest of the show. So they got JMS to go back and they recorded a new score for it. They redid the title so it looked like the show. And they just sort of cleaned up the edit a little bit. Now, I'll put this video on here. This is the original. This is from the original pilot version. This is from the opening titles of it. Check this out.
It's like Miami Vice in the sky.
I mean, it's a bit like, you know, when you see people do these parodies where they'll be like, Breaking Bad, but if it was an 80s sitcom, you know, that kind of thing. That was it. So
Home Alone is a horror film as well, I saw recently.
So when I say the TNT version, what I mean is the version that's been retroactively brought in line to feel like the show. So you can probably see why I chose this version for a bit of a... and also that version is probably only available in sort of horrible quality. It's also worth mentioning that the pilot, The Gathering, in both versions, neither of them have been remastered for HD when the rest of the show has. So I would say in many ways, Babylon 5 is the absolute poster child for the first season is a little sketchy, stick with it, which is a big 90s sci-fi thing. You know, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine. There's the whole, you know, those shows weren't great. Now, I love them. I love the first season of Babylon 5. That isn't my opinion. But I feel like I've got enough movie and TV watching empathy to know that a lot of people might watch it and go, ooh, some of the acting's a little bit wooden or rushed or, you know, undercast. And
see, I feel like it's one of my children, and if anyone says anything bad, I'm gonna.
Yeah, well, like where I say it, but you know, and also, and the CG effects do look like a cutscene from a CD-ROM video game from like Wing Commander or something like that, and all those kind of things. But there's several things happening here. Is first of all, I don't think that's important, and second of all of those things do actually improve.
Yeah, they do.
You know,
yeah.
So I think that if you're and this is what we said to Mark, if you're a sci-fi fan who has a tolerance for those kind of things and likes good storytelling. And although I joke about the woodenness of some of the acting, and I'll get into a couple of specifics when we go through the episode a little bit, there is also tremendous acting in this, particularly from a lot of the actors who play the alien characters. And that gets even greater as they find their characters' voices and the writers find their characters' voices as well. So watching this now, the thing that surprised me was how much road is paved, how much foreshadowing is actually done, and how much evidence there is that JMS knew where he was going.
Absolutely. Just the confidence in not rushing to get to any particular point.
Keeping those cards in his back pocket.
Yeah.
Because we know where it goes, and there's hints of it here, and it's so incredible where the storyline goes, and to know that he had to restrain himself from playing those cards.
Well, given that each season is like a full 22, 24 episodes per season.
It's a lot of content.
It is a lot of content, and you know, he does take his time in telling it. And I don't mean that and that there's any kind of filler episodes, because there's not. There's just a lot of story.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really quite impressive when you see it. The one thing I was worried about when we watched it the first time, so Mike had said to me, you really have to pay attention with the show. You know, from a, like, don't check a text at the same time as you're watching it, things like that, which is, you know, a fair point. But I worried that it was going to be too much to kind of take in everything.
More like a complex narrative, kind of.
Sometimes I can struggle if characters are talking really quickly. Like it just becomes words that are washing over me rather than actually hearing what they're saying.
Particularly if you're disengaged with what you're watching. That's the other thing.
Do you ever find that? Like if you've got a character talking quite quickly and rapidly giving you information, you only really take about half of it in.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, if that happens, I'm going to be screwed. But the one thing I really like about JMS's writing is there's plenty there. There's plenty of story, and he wants you to pay attention, but he doesn't make it. It's not like a Rubik's Cube to solve to work out what's going on. It's very much follow the story, keep your eyes and ears open, and just let it go in. There's
such clarity to the storyline as well. We've talked about this before, about how well-defined, particularly as the show goes on and the production values increase, how the alien races are so well-defined from a aesthetic perspective. You know which ships you're looking at. They're so well-defined from a culture perspective. And
like architecture and all that kind of stuff, you know when it's a Centauri building.
You know what you're looking at.
Yeah.
And although the storyline is complex in the sense that it's, you know, it's almost like a Russian epic, you know, the storytelling is crisp, it's clean, it's efficient, but crucially, it's engaging, you know, because like I've said before, I've tried watching Game of Thrones several times and I'm like, I can't keep up with all the characters, can't keep up with the names. And partly it's because my attention wanders, you know, and that's not a criticism of the show. It's just not resonating with me. And when something resonates with me, and good storytelling helps with that, I do connect. So I think that seeing this pilot, it's interesting because, it is janky. It is, you can see the budget. You can see the issues.
But sort of lovably janky.
No, but that's the thing, is that now some of the elements of the show that you could argue as being shortcomings really add to the charm in the same way that, old Doctor Who or the 60s Star Trek, it's that kind of thing. You kind of like, there's an bless element. And I don't mean that condescendingly.
No.
It's part of because now, obviously...
It's reminiscent.
Yeah, I mean, we've got incredible visuals on TV shows now. They're almost indecipherable from feature films. But everything kind of looks the same, whereas there's a wildness and an eccentricity to this stuff. And I think that...
It was a simpler time.
It was a simpler time. But I would say, though, that those... It's a little bit like, when you see very early Seinfeld and it looks really 80s. It's a similar thing, is the fact that watching early Babylon 5, it feels 80s, like on the pilot, some of the colour schemes look really 80s. But I'll tell you what, a large chunk of that, for good or bad, is completely gone in the next episode because the colour schemes from the show are down. Like I say, the main issues I had with performances in this episode are not an issue, shall we say, in the next episode.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting watching this now is the glimpses of what the show can be that you get.
Yeah.
Like there's stuff in here where I do roll my eyes a little bit and I'm like, okay, all right, okay, you probably should have done a second take of that, but you probably didn't have the time or the money to do that. But there are also moments where I'm like, there's flashes of what Babylon 5 ultimately will be. There's flashes of greatness where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's starting to, it's like when somebody's writing a song or a band are jamming and then they come across a bit of a riff and the band lock into it. But there's a little bit of that happening. But should we get into it? I don't want to go beat by beat because I don't want us to go too long on this. But there's a few little reminders I've got, and I have put a little note next to a few things where I would say that they are spoilers. So I'll sort of like hold on to those as well. So, I mean, we open up with a voiceover from Londo telling us that the year is 2257. And it's interesting as well that every season is a year. But season 1 is 2258 and season 2 is 2259. You see, this is how numbers work, Hannah. I just figured I'd explain.
This is the my explaining section.
You can see why through years of mental abuse, I made Hannah worry she wouldn't understand Babylon 5 because
apparently I don't know how to count.
Do you think my pretty little brain will be able to? Oh, little lady, I reckon I'll help you through. Oh, darling. But
my big strong man.
But this episode is meant to represent the whole of that year, and of course, the whole of the next year is the whole of the next season, and season 2. So, I mean, we've got the kind of the caper of the week, which is all of the stuff around Delvana. But that does tie into this larger sense because what we've got here is some great world building because we learn a huge amount of information in this episode, but I don't feel like the characters are just sitting us down and telling us stuff. It feels like there's movement and energy and things are happening and there's life.
There's not any... as my second cousin from my father's side once told me, blah, blah, blah,
but
blah,
the scenes
blah.
where people are, like, for example, the scene where Sinclair is telling his girlfriend about the Battle of the Line, he is essentially just talking and telling her information, but it's engaging.
Yeah.
It's the way it's filmed and scored and performed. It makes you kind of lean in a little bit as well. It brings you in and engages you. It's that word again, engaging. And I think that works really well. I mean, Michael O'Hare, the lead in this, I love this guy. He's a classic example of the I can make fun of him and no one else can because he's very much an old school TV actor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I could imagine him in like the A-Team or, he's one of those very earnest actors who, I can imagine him in Westerns, he's one of those sort of actors. And it's one of those things where you can make fun of him because it is that very kind of traditional type of acting. But there's something so, and I use this in the positive sense of the word, cheesy about him that I really admire. And
I think he's perfect for that role.
Yeah, because it's a paternal thing ultimately. Because I mean, I've one of the things that's unique for me about Babylon 5 is it's the TV show where I've met the most amount of people. Because at the convention, I met all of them, and I've interviewed a few of them in the years since and stayed in touch with them. And Michael O'Hare, I mean, what a great name, O'Hare.
I just love that his name's Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff, man. Because I always think of
right?
Oh gosh, well, I always think of Biker Grove. Jeff, man, you got pie in your beard. That's what I always think about that. Whenever I hear Jeff, I always think Jeff, man. I remember meeting him at the convention, and my friend Dan, who, as I say, we had been to the bar, just wandered over to him and was just like, he's like, I love you, you're so cheesy. And he said it in a positive way. And Michael O'Hare was just like, oh, yes. Like almost like Bob Monkhouse kind of like, he just was the character.
Yeah.
And I love that about him. So, and again, it's one of those things like, I suppose like William Shatner and David Hasselhoff and actors like that where, you can kind of make fun of it a little bit, but at the same time, they bring such energy to what often can be quite thankless dialogue. Like people make fun of William Shatner because of his pointy delivery. But when you watch Jeffrey Hunter, another Jeff, who was the original captain in Star Trek, who's arguably a better actor than William Shatner, it's so lifeless, his performance. And when Shatner comes in, it just brings so much energy and charisma to the role. And I think that's what they were going for here. And I don't think he does completely work in the long run, but I like him. There's something very ingratiating and appealing about his performance style, which suits this, because this is 1993, so this is still really early in the modern cycle of science fiction. And it's early enough that we were still very much in that 1980s style. Yeah. And I think that you see that change as the show goes on. But I really like him in that role. I think for me, where the cast falls down really in the main cast is the Doctor
and the security.
And the first...
not
first
security.
officer.
First officer, yeah.
I just feel like both of them are good actors, but who are slumming it.
Yeah.
I think of Alan Rickman's character in Galaxy Quest. It feels like they're doing sci-fi acting.
Yeah.
Their attitude is, and you see this a lot on Star Trek sometimes, where actors who are great in other things, it's as though they're like, oh, well, it's sci-fi, so it's a kid's show.
I felt like neither of them looked like they'd held a coffee cup when they were
just not believable as human beings.
Together.
And what I will say is...
But I kind of love that.
Yeah, I mean, this is the only spoiler I will say in this pilot conversation, because ultimately it's immediately apparent at the beginning of the next episode.
And it doesn't matter.
Yeah, is neither of those two actors come back.
No.
And there's been lots of reasons over the years, but I think we're all grown up enough to admit that they just didn't work.
No, they didn't.
And I'm not saying that they're bad actors. I just think that they were miscast. And I've seen her in a bunch of other films, and she's great. She was the love interest in Karate Kid 2.
In the high spots.
Yep. And she had a really prominent role in Star Trek Picard, and she was great in that, She was the Romulan Starfleet turncoat in the first season.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And she's a great actor, but I just think that a lot of actors in the early 90s, this is before the mainstreaming of geek culture, figured if you were in a sci-fi series, you just could just phone it in.
A certain way.
And they're just so wooden. And when you see the actors who come in, their characters leave the show. When you see the new characters who come in, who essentially fill their roles, it's like night and day.
It really is. And so much the better for it.
Yeah.
The replacement characters are fabulous.
Yeah. Another one of the actors, I won't say who here because this is a little bit more complex as this. Another one of the lead characters doesn't return to the show as well, but will come back into the show later. And that was for different reasons, and that they put in a great performance in this episode. So I think there's different reasons there. So that's another one of the things that is, and I want to get into this idea of trapdoors. This is what it's a writing technique, and JMS said that basically he had this really long storyline, but he understood the practicalities of television. Particularly when you're making these long seasons, is people leave shows, people aren't available. You can't necessarily keep everybody on the payroll. You have a lot of recurring characters. People die. So he said he had what was called a trapdoor for every character. So every character had a way of being replaced if the actor was unavailable. He said he didn't like the idea of recasting, but he could swap the characters out. And you see several times characters' storylines get swapped out. And that happens almost immediately. It happens between this and the next episode as well.
I kind of love that they don't just expect you to take a different person as the same character.
Yeah. Becky and Roseanne syndrome.
Yeah, it kind of keeps you within the world rather than pulling you out.
Yeah,
thinking,
and it shows
that you're an idiot.
His agility as a writer as well. I also want to mention one of my favourite pieces of world building here is the introduction of the telepaths with Lita. I love the idea that you learn so much with such economy.
Yeah,
you learn that there's a governing body called Psychor. Little things like you learn that they're sort of indoctrinated, that they're not allowed to take their gloves off. So there is a slight, you get a sense of the way that she dresses, and this is again a great piece of storytelling, has a slightly fascistic kind of Kafkaesque quality to it.
Sort of masculine woman.
Yeah. Well, it just looks vaguely Nazi-ish, I guess.
Yeah.
Some of the other characters were introduced to Jerry Doyle as Garibaldi.
He's fabulous.
He's Bruce Willis, isn't he? I mean, that's
really
the thing. You've got to say it that he is.
Yeah, he is. I love his ease in front of the camera and just his timbre of his speech is just nice, and he's really easy to follow and listen to, and his interactions with Jeff Mann are great, and you can see like there's that instant bond between
you don't need to be told anything.
No, it is all there, and you sort of feel like they convey pretty easily that he's someone, that rogue sort of, you put your life on the line to give them a chance. They've screwed up in the past, but they're really a good egg.
And the other reason that I sort of compare him to Bruce Willis is it's not just his sort of his hairline and his sort of like general look. He's got that, and we talked about this a little bit when we covered Meatballs. He's got that kind of slight Bill Murray-ish kind of immediately know you'd love to go for a pint with that guy.
Yeah.
And I think
is he nice in real life?
He is, yeah. And the actor's got a very easy kind of inclusive charisma. There's a podcast I listen to called Inglorious Trexperts, and basically they're all people who've worked in the business, and they tell a story about how they went out drinking with Jerry Doyle after a convention, and they saw a party at a frat house.
Oh yeah.
And he was like, and Jerry Doyle was like, let's go in. And they're like, dude, we're like, we're like guys in our 40s. What the hell? And they said that they went in and they were hanging around, and like all of the writer guys who do the podcast were sort of just there feeling really old. And they say eventually they walked back into a room, and they said that Jerry Doyle was just sat in the middle of the room, and it was all of these sort of 20-year-old students who were all drinking and stuff who he'd never met before. And he was just holding court. He said they were all just like almost sat at his feet, and he was just telling them all these hilarious stories. And they said he was one of those guys who could just walk in a room and immediately everybody liked him. And I think that you get that from his character.
Yeah.
And I think you need that. I think when you've got alien races and encounter suits and frictionless sheets, you need a guy who has that kind of working class, salt of the earth energy.
Well, he has that present day Earth feel about him, like he's not sci-fi.
It feels like he should be like a taxi driver or something. He's got that kind of sure. And the thing about Babylon 5 as well, unlike Star Trek, is it's meant to be almost like a working class thing. It's like they've got like budget problems and labor union problems. It's not like Star Trek where, there's no money and everything's just complete utopia. It's a different kind of thing.
It's very much more of a real vibe in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got the alien sector as well. And I think one of the things that I like about Babylon 5 that I really like about Farscape as well is the aliens really feel alien. It feels like they've evolved out of a completely different primordial goo than we have.
I love the fact that they have a nod to the fact that they might need different atmospheres. And things like that. Like I'm not one that needs the uber realism in sci-fi.
No.
But
uber realism usually ends up being really boring.
Yeah. But for me, it was a nice nod that there was some consideration of it, they don't all just breathe oxygen.
Yeah, they don't just look like humans with Cornish pasties on their forehead.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think one of the things that works for me in this episode is the core alien characters as well. So I think specifically Delenn, G'Kar and Londo. They and as often happens in science fiction, they hire these great actors because they have to kind of get through the prosthetics. So they often hire theatrical. And Mira Furlan, who's from former Yugoslavia.
R.I.P. Mira.
Yeah. She had to. She had to flee the country, but she was extremely famous. She was like the Yugoslavian Meryl Streep. She was in Oscar-nominated films. Really, really talented actress. And her character is in a lot of prosthetics in this. That's another change that happens between now and the next episode. But she's just got, I think because of her ethnicity, she brings this really interesting accent.
Quite otherworldly,
exotic
to her.
Yeah. And her character, particularly in this episode, has a androgynous quality. And a mysterious quality that I think really adds to her scenes. Like I love one of the scenes. There's about 3 or 4 of them. One of the scenes in this episode that kind of gave me B5 goosebumps and was like, oh yeah, there it is. There's the show. Is when she's having the conversation in the sand garden with Sinclair, and they've got really great chemistry as actors because I think Michael O'Hare's really good in quiet moments.
Yeah.
I think when he's doing quiet intensity, he's really good. It's when he has to go big that I think it gets a little bit misjudged. But when she's talking about the dropping a stone into one of the circles and disruption, as we call it in the modern world, I guess, the idea of how much difference somebody can make. What I love there, and again, it's not a spoiler because it's so esoteric, is that's really, in many ways, introducing the central theme of the entire show.
Yeah.
The idea of the one person being able to have this impact. And the vibe of those scenes really works, I think.
Yeah.
And and particularly in the later scenes where there's that coy kind of politic reading between the lines feeling of their conversation where, he's like, do you know anything else about this? And she's like, I wouldn't tell you anything that wouldn't be in your best interest, and that kind of dance feel of those scenes really works.
Yeah, very much so. Just as a side note, Mike has interviewed Mira Furlan.
Her final ever interview.
Yeah.
That was.
So go and check that out. I'm sure Mike will put a link here on my hand.
What I'll probably do is, I won't actually because, is because I think I'll probably include that as an episode of this when we get to a point in the show where it would make sense to do that.
Okay.
But
it's very good.
It's interesting as well. I won't say who, but there's an actor who will come back in the show in a different character as a glorified extra in this as well. And then I think one of the other scenes where I really felt the show starting to show its potential was the scene when Londo's talking to Garibaldi.
Yeah, that was my favourite scene. Because
you really get a sense. And it's funny because Mark talked about, Mark from The Good, the Bad and the Odd, about how when he saw an episode of Babylon 5, he's like, I just remember a guy dressed like Napoleon with silly hair. And it's funny because I've never thought of it, but I guess he does dress like Napoleon. And it makes sense why. Because he was from an empire.
Yeah.
He was from this great empire. that was like one of the great European powers. But he's dining on old glories. You know, he's the guy at the bar who's kind of like, buy me a drink and I'll tell you a story.
Back in my day.
Yeah, everything was great. And I think
this was all fields.
Yeah, exactly. and I think that there's real pathos in the scene where he's talking to Garibaldi. And one of the other big themes of Babylon 5 is nobody really is what they appear to be.
No.
And how dangerous it is to judge people. And even in this pilot, you know, you see Londo and you think he's kind of a comedy character.
Yeah.
He's kind of a buffoony character at this stage. But you do see real humanity in him, particularly, and it's his delivery of the line where he's like, my God, man, we've become a tourist attraction. And he's like, you know, at open earth hours. And I think that that's great writing. I think but I think, again, you're starting to see glimpses of some of the show's secret weapons. And Peter Jurassic, who plays Londo, is one of them.
100%. I also love in that conversation when Garibaldi says to him, if you had known that information, would it have changed what you'd have done? And he just flat out says, no, it wouldn't.
But I love the delivery.
He's still sorry about it.
Yeah.
And it kind of sums up a lot of you know, situations that occur that they know what would be the most humane thing to do, but that's ultimately not the easy thing to do.
It's resignation. And I love the way he says it. He's like, this is my weakness, you know.
Yeah.
But he's honest.
Yeah, he is.
It.
Yeah.
And then you've got Jakar, who, in this episode at least, is very much the moustache twirler. He's the kind of scheming guy who is a kind of antagonist. And he's being set up at this stage as being the one you've got to keep your eye on, you know, because you've got all of this grand stuff going on with the Vorlons and the Minbari.
Two-faced kind of character at this point.
But it's a local thing because you've got all this mystery with the Vorlons. And I think that's the other element of what makes Babylon 5 great that you see at this stage is the mysterious elements to it. Because one of the things I think that separates Babylon 5 from Star Trek is Babylon 5 does, at points, and you get glimpses of it here, veer into fantasy, veer into Tolkien, and veer into Lord of the Rings. And I think that the Vorlons and the mystery around them and the mythologizing of them and some of the mystery around the Minbari, that's Delen's people, is your first glimpse of the fact that maybe Babylon 5's actually going to go bigger than Star Trek.
Yeah.
Whereas Star Trek's about ambassadors and spaceships and territory and science. Maybe Babylon 5's going to go wider than that. And you get a little glimpse of it here.
There's a lot more about, you know, origins of people and history and politics.
Yeah.
That's very and it is that sort of Lord of the Rings, you know, thinking about things like Rohan's got a chip on their shoulder because, you know,
old grudges.
Yeah, exactly. That the alliances that once were and old hurts that need to be resolved and things like that. And obviously as the show progresses, everything expands. But it is really quite amazing where it starts.
I also love that this was a time when making video calls seemed so futuristic.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, not frictionless sheets futuristic, but futuristic. We get another really memorable scene is the scene between Jakar and Lita, the pleasure thresholds one, which Patricia Tallman actually called her autobiography Pleasure Thresholds, which which I think is a great thing. And she's met Chloe.
She has.
Chloe wandered in, and I was like, she's like, "Oh, get your daughter over," and Chloe just stood there looking really bored for her.
Hi.
Yes, and also again, it's a classic example of what makes Babylon 5 great because it's an entertaining scene, it's funny, it's a little bit risky, all this kind of stuff, but also you learn stuff.
Yeah.
You learn that the Narns don't have telepaths, and there's this genetic thing, and that Jakar is sort of scheming to try and get ahead. And it's this idea that Jakar's willing to cheat and that the Narns maybe have just been disadvantaged, and he wants to redress that.
And are the political equivalent of the nouveau riche. They're very new to having any kind of influence and power within a political structure.
And they don't really know how to wield it.
Having been slaves to the Centauri.
Yeah, and that's a really crucial element, isn't it? Is this history, is the idea that the Centauri enslaved them, but then as the Centauri drifted into decadence and sort of obsolescence, their grip loosened and the Narns are now free. So that's the situation there. We also learn about the Earth-Minbari War as well. Incredible amount of information and world building here. Yeah. And we learned that this was a big war, and really it was in the 11th hour. It was very much this battle of the line that Sinclair was in. And I love the way it's I mean, again, I love it because I can make fun of it because I love it, but it's such a wonderful cliche, when he's telling the story and you can hear the, pull up, man, pull up, no, and all that. It reminds me of, in Airplane when he's talking about in the war and he's like, oh, and, poor young Jono got shot down. And, I can't help but think of that. And it is the cliche kind of thing.
Yeah.
But again, that's just sort of the time when the show was made. And again, it's very charming.
Yeah.
But it's a great scene because, again, you're leaning in because there is a mystery. You do learn that the Minbari had them massively overpowered and over... they had the technological advantage as well and the strategic advantage. And that the Battle of the Line was basically, a suicide, throwing everything that they can at them to try and prevent Earth being annihilated. And they just stopped. And associated with that is this 24-hour block in his memory. And there's references to it from the Minbari assassin. So that's an interesting thing. And I think that it was smart of JMS to weave in these mysteries to enrich that. But what I will say to first-time viewers is this isn't a trick.
No,
this isn't a kind of bait and switch, tune in for next week's episode kind of, J.J. Abrams mystery box. This is simply the beginning of a story.
It really is. Yeah.
That will continue.
That will unfold and be answered.
Yeah.
There is answers at the end of things. There's no... there's not even any ambiguity in what it is. You
don't find out that they were all just really in purgatory all along.
Yeah. Or in Twin Peaks that they were, they end up in a different world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's much more linear than...
it's very straightforward.
Yeah. So, okay, well, I mean, but what we'll do is we'll wrap up. We'll do the end of show stuff, and then we'll do maybe just a few minutes of spoiler stuff at the end as well. So before we do that, Hannah, any final thoughts on this episode for our non-spoiler viewers and listeners?
Nothing other than to say welcome to Babylon 5. We're open for business.
Yes, we are. And next year will be 2258. And I'll stop right there. No, I really enjoyed rewatching this tonight, and I'm really looking forward to getting into HD Babylon 5 with the next episode, so that'll be a lot of fun. So quick reminder that we do appreciate feedback. You can send that to rewatchprojectpodcast@gmail.com, or alternatively, you can leave comments right here on the YouTube channel. And yes, that's going to be a thing. Please do check out our friend shows. Also check out the other film, television, music, and general pop culture related goodness that cohabits this YouTube channel, if that's how you're consuming this podcast, if that's how you choose to live your life. We also appreciate positive reviews over on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. And if you are watching Babylon 5 for the first time, we will see you very soon.
Bye-bye.
Right, okay, now we got rid of those douchebags. Sinclair is Valen. And he says it. He says, was it like Isildur Valen or something like that?
Yeah.
It's right there. It's right there. So, God, I do hope that people have. Although, to be honest with you, if you haven't watched this before, you're going to be like, "Who's Valen?"
Yeah.
It's not going to have any meaning.
But
anyway.
this just reminds me of when we first started the Rewatch Project. When we got to the spoiler section of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., every single time we would say, Sinclair is Valen.
Yeah.
It's like and break.
Yeah.
Ready, say it all.
And the thing is, I mean, there's tons of foreshadowing in this. And it's like, I mean, I'd even forgotten that they introduced the idea of what happened at the Battle of the Line in this episode.
Yeah.
You've got all of that. You've got the foreshadowing of the Narn taking back, getting revenge on the Centauri. You've got foreshadowing of Londo's weakness. He even says, "This is my weakness," and that's the weakness that will be exploited, that will set fire to the galaxy. So that's all there, and it is interesting. And as far as the trapdoors goes, Patricia Tormund doesn't come back until many seasons later.
And that was more of she'd had a baby, hadn't she?
Yeah, there was a lot of, it was all personal stuff.
She talks about it.
Yeah, she wasn't fired or anything like that. It was a year later and her life had changed.
Yeah. Mike did an interview with her that she talks about all of that kind of thing. So it's worth a watch.
Yeah. And I think that the other two actors, I believe that they just didn't think that they were working. But it is interesting though, the thing that works out great though, is that all three of the actors who don't come back are the three actors that are strongly associated with the Kosh storyline. So it gives them a reason. Like there's a whole thing about how they're the only ones who know what Kosh really is. So, and they were mysteriously reassigned. So it does actually make sense that they would be the three that went.
Yeah.
And they're all replaced by really good actors. And the funny thing is that I said before about how you get some storylines get given to a different character. Well, in the case of Lita, her storyline gets given to a different character, and then it gets given back to her when that other person leaves as well. So this actress leaves, and they're like, "Oh God, what are we going to do now?" And they're like, "Well, why don't we just get the actress who was originally going to do it, and we'll just get the storyline back on her track." And it's interesting as well. Did you notice that the doctor said, "Oh, I'm really tired. I've took some stims." Yeah, because the character who replaced him, he gets addicted to stims. So JMS was obviously foreshadowing that storyline, and I think he was just like, "Oh, no one will remember. I'll just." But also, in that case, it's just an innocuous thing. He just had, some Red Bull or whatever,
to do that. Yeah.
So it's really interesting seeing all that stuff, and all the stuff with Delenn as well, because the original idea for the show was, and they had to redub the pilot for this. Is the reason that Delenn's got all that makeup on is that how she goes for a transformation at the end of season 1 when she goes into the chrysalis, and then she comes out and she's got hair and all that kind of stuff. Well, the original idea was that she was male.
Right, okay.
And that she was going to come out of the chrysalis and have changed gender.
Right.
But they decided they weren't going to do that. So they just redubbed all of the dialogue to say her, not him. Just changed the makeup because they felt that it softened it and the character was too unrelatable, and then just had her change to be more human as a diplomatic bridge between the humans and the Minbari. So that all kind of makes sense. But it is funny whenever anybody says, "Oh, she or her," when to look for it, it's quite obviously ADR'd, But I find all that stuff interesting, and that is kind of progressive.
And it's not massively noticeable when you're watching it.
Yeah, it's more like when you go back. And I mean, some of the other changes as well. I struggle with the costuming in this episode, the way that everybody on the bridge is wearing these big kind of white, it's like the Seinfeld puffy shirts. And everything, like I say, it's lit and everything's got this kind of weird neon-y kind of, very 80s. And then as soon as you get into the next episode, it's greys and blacks and blues. And it's just much more aesthetically consistent and less 1993 and a little bit more 1994, aka the year after 1993. I'm going to stop this. Anything else from a spoiler perspective that you want to mention, Hannah?
I think, like when I was saying earlier about when I was seeing the characters and thinking about how they progress, I remember the first time watching this, like really thinking, Jakar, bad guy. And this time, knowing the journey he's got ahead of him.
And Londo.
Obviously. I mean, Londo's my favourite character from B5.
I flip-flop between those two. I feel like they're of a piece.
Yeah, but Jakar would be a very close second.
I mean, there's an argument for saying that Babylon 5 ultimately is Londo's story.
Yeah. And actually, I had forgotten that he does the voiceover at the start of this.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it makes sense that it's him doing it because it really is his account of everything that happened. There's one scene of Jakar that from the entire series of B5 that I think about all the time, just as a random thing, when he gets tortured by the Centauri, the
Emperor.
Crazy Emperor.
Emperor Kataja.
That's one. When he wants him to scream, and it just cuts to outside, and there's absolutely zero noise and blood running out, or like there's some visual. I like, it makes me squirm thinking about it every time, and just you just have so much sympathy for him.
Well, there's a lot of character reversals. Characters start off as one thing, or they were one thing all along, but you only got to see it from another character's perspective, and then you spend time with them and you see how they got there. And I think one of the great things about Babylon 5 is how it does usurp those expectations. But should we wrap it up for now then, Hannah?
Sure.
So what are we talking about next time?
Our next episode is called Midnight on the Firing Line. Synopsis says, the Narn attack a Centauri colony while raiders attack transport ships. Talia Winters arrives at the station. It is directed by Richard Compton and written by your friend of mine, J. Michael Straczynski.
Alrighty, well, we'll be back very soon with the next episode of Babylon 5. We will see you very soon. Goodbye.
See you later.